The convent of St. Bridget clung to the mountainside like a promise made in stone, its walls weathered by decades of wind and snow, and within those walls Sister Agnes learned that devotion did not always shield one from quiet cruelty. She had entered the order believing that faith erased differences, that humility softened all judgments, yet from the earliest days her body marked her as other. Broader shoulders, fuller hips, arms shaped by years of labor before her vows, none of it fit the unspoken image of sanctity the other sisters carried in their minds. No one spoke openly, but silence became a language of its own, benches left empty beside her, tasks assigned that kept her apart, glances that lingered too long and then looked away. Agnes prayed harder in response, believing endurance was her offering, believing suffering refined the soul. But as seasons passed, she felt the weight of being seen only as a shape rather than a servant of God, and in the stillness of night she wondered why love felt conditional inside a house built to teach unconditional grace. Beyond the convent, the mountain lived by rules older than scripture, and Elias Crow moved through them with practiced ease. He was known among valley villages as the mountain man, a solitary figure wrapped in furs and silence, whose knowledge of trails and storms bordered on myth. Elias had learned early that nature did not care for appearances, only resilience. After losing his family to a sudden rockslide years before, he had chosen solitude not out of bitterness, but survival, finding clarity in the honest demands of the wild. He trapped, guided, and traded when necessary, speaking little and observing much. From certain ridges he could see the convent, its bell echoing faintly across the snowfields, and he noticed one small, repeating detail over time, a lone nun often sent farther than the rest, carrying heavier loads, walking paths others avoided. Elias did not know her name, but he recognized quiet endurance when he saw it, and something about that persistence stayed with him. The winter that changed everything arrived early, burying paths before the ground had fully hardened. Snow fell thick and relentless, swallowing familiar landmarks and testing even the strongest travelers. Supplies at the convent dwindled faster than expected, and fear crept into prayers whispered before dawn. Sister Agnes was assigned to gather fallen wood beyond the usual boundary, a task framed as necessity but carrying the familiar undertone of isolation. She accepted without protest, wrapping herself tightly and stepping into drifts that pulled at her legs. Hours passed, clouds thickened, and the trail disappeared beneath an unbroken white silence. Fatigue set in, followed by the creeping numbness of cold that bargains gently before it takes. When Agnes realized she was lost, panic surged, then settled into a fragile calm as she knelt in the snow and prayed not for rescue, but for steadiness. It was then that Elias saw her, a dark figure struggling against the storm, and without hesitation he moved toward her, extending an arm, offering warmth and direction without a single unnecessary word. Elias brought Agnes to his cabin as the storm hulled around them, building a fire with the efficiency of long habit and wrapping her in furs that smelled of pine and smoke. There were no questions, no accusations, only practical care, hot broth, dry clothes, rest. Agnes felt a strange disorientation in the absence of judgment, as if her body, so often scrutinized, had become simply human again. When dawn broke and the storm retreated, Elias guided her back toward the convent, the world glittering with cold clarity. Yet before they reached the gates, they encountered whispers already forming in the village below, half-seen figures, assumptions sharpened into stories. By the time Agnes stood before the abbess, the truth mattered less than appearances. Her explanation was met with tight smiles and folded hands, and the knowledge that a mountain man had sheltered her became a convenient shape for suspicion. Penance followed, heavier duties, deeper isolation, and the familiar message that silence was the holiest response. Elias did not attend the judgment, but he felt its weight when he heard fragments carried by traders and travelers. He understood how lies gained strength through repetition, how institutions often protected comfort over fairness. For days he said nothing, considering the cost of intervention, knowing well that challenging accepted narratives could bring ridicule or worse. Yet the memory of Agnes kneeling in the snow, praying without complaint, refused to leave him. Finally, he chose action. Elias began traveling deliberately through valleys and passes, telling the same plain story to anyone who would listen. He described the storm, the rescue, the evidence winter had not erased. He spoke to farmers, merchants, and clergy, offering to guide them to the place, to show tracks and broken branches. He did not embellish or beg belief, he simply repeated the truth until it became difficult to ignore. His reputation for honesty lent his words weight, and slowly, doubt crept into certainty. As Elias persisted, the rumors began to fracture. Some listeners resisted, clinging to the comfort of judgment, but others began to question what they had accepted so easily. When he finally returned to the convent gates, the atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly. Inside, small gestures marked the change: a shared meal, a conversation resumed, an assignment given without undertone. The abbess summoned Agnes again, this time alone, and though pride still lingered, acknowledgement followed. No full apology was offered, but the harshest penalties were lifted, and the unspoken sentence softened. Agnes listened quietly, accepting what was given without triumph, understanding that institutions moved slowly, reshaped by pressure rather than confrontation. When she later saw Elias waiting beyond the gate, she felt gratitude deepen into clarity. Dignity was not something granted by authority, but something defended through courage. Life within the convent gradually transformed. Agnes was entrusted with the infirmary, where her strength and patience became invaluable. She cared for bodies without judgment, understanding intimately how pain ignored appearances. Sisters who once avoided her now relied on her steadiness, and through shared labor, old assumptions began to erode. Agnes's prayers changed in tone, less pleading and more grounded, shaped by lived compassion rather than endurance alone. She continued to walk the outer paths, now by choice, tending gardens and gathering herbs, finding peace in movement. Elias passed through occasionally, trading supplies, exchanging a few quiet words. Their connection remained simple, defined by respect rather than obligation, a shared understanding that the unthinkable act he had taken was never meant for praise, only correction. Over time, the story spread without names, transforming into a quiet lesson repeated among villages and travelers. The convent itself changed practices, formalizing shelter for those lost in storms, replacing suspicion with preparation. Agnes helped shape these changes, speaking from experience rather than accusation, insisting that mercy required intention. Elias guided many through dangerous passes in the years that followed, refusing thanks, disappearing back into the trees once safety was assured. The mountain remained indifferent, but those who lived beneath it learned something essential. Righteousness was not measured by appearance or silence, but by the willingness to stand against unfairness when it mattered most. As years passed, Agnes grew older, her presence becoming a source of reassurance for new sisters who arrived carrying their own insecurities. She welcomed them warmly, teaching that bodies were instruments of service, not obstacles to holiness. On clear days, she would stand along the wall, looking toward the ridgeline where Elias still walked, knowing that solidarity did not require constant closeness to endure. Their lives remained separate, yet connected by a shared moment that had altered the direction of many hearts. When asked what had changed the convent most, Agnes answered simply that someone had refused to let a lie stand, and others had found the courage to listen. When Elias did not return one winter, the mountain kept its silence. The valleys mourned quietly, through stories shared and paths remembered. Agnes planted a pine near the outer path, its roots gripping stone as stubbornly as he once had. She prayed there often, not for miracles, but for remembrance. The unthinkable act that had once seemed disruptive had become a measure of quiet courage. As the convent bell rang across the snow, its echo carried a promise beyond doctrine, that dignity defended could take root anywhere, even in frozen ground, and that faith paired with action could change not only reputations, but the direction of human hearts. Nun ostracized story, mountain men rescues nun, inspirational religious story, faith and compassion narrative, convent life drama, winter survival story, body shaming redemption, true courage tale, inspirational mountain story, nun discrimination story, rural faith drama, unthinkable act kindness, Christian inspirational fiction, overcoming judgment story, mountain rescue faith, resilience and dignity, silent strength story, spiritual transformation tale, isolation and compassion, moral redemption story, inspirational short novel, faith-tested story, kindness changes lives, mountainman legend, convent redemption arc, human dignity narrative, inspirational drama fiction, faith versus prejudice, courage against injustice, redemption through action. Time moved forward with a patience that felt deliberate, and the convent settled into a rhythm shaped by lessons it rarely spoke aloud. Sister Agnes became a fixed point within that rhythm, not through authority but reliability, the kind that accumulates quietly until it is indispensable. She woke before the bell, prepared the infirmary, checked stores, and walked the grounds with an eye trained to notice what others overlooked. Her body, once the focus of scrutiny, became simply the means by which work was done, lifting, carrying, steadying the ill when pain robbed them of balance. The sisters who had once measured holiness by narrow standards now encountered it in practice, watching Agnes remain unresentful even when memory offered reasons to be. That absence of bitterness unsettled some more than open anger would have, because it denied them the comfort of moral hierarchy. Agnes understood this and allowed the discomfort to exist, trusting time to do its work more effectively than confrontation. The mountain continued its cycles, indifferent to institutional reform, and the paths Elias had carved through snow and stone remained in use long after his steps grew slower. Next. The convent walls, once oppressive with judgment, began to echo with different sounds as Sister Agnes's presence became increasingly acknowledged. Where her body had once invited whispers, her hands now drew admiration for skill and precision in the infirmary, where she treated ailments both mundane and serious. The sisters who had shunned her began to observe how she moved with quiet confidence, how she spoke softly but with authority when tending to the sick. Agnes understood the power of persistence. Years of silent endurance had taught her patience, and she approached each day with a steady rhythm that even the youngest novices began to emulate. There was still tension in certain corners, but it had softened, replaced by a cautious respect that grew subtly into genuine regard. Agnes found herself increasingly reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her from isolation and judgment into a position where her character, rather than her body, commanded attention. She realized that real power was quiet, the sort that reshaped attitudes slowly but irreversibly. Elias continued his solitary life in the mountains, yet the bond he shared with Agnes persisted like an unspoken current linking two worlds. He would occasionally descend to the convent, leaving bundles of herbs, wild game, or news of travelers trapped in the snow, always arriving without ceremony and departing without acknowledgement. Each encounter reminded Agnes that courage did not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it was measured in consistent acts that spoke louder than words. In his rare presence, she saw the reflection of endurance and resilience that she had cultivated herself, and the two quietly recognized the truth that friendship and respect often transcended spoken declarations. Their connection, built on unassuming deeds and trust, became a model for those watching, proof that unconventional alliances could challenge entrenched judgments and reshape communities. The convent, in turn, began to embrace subtle reforms inspired by the story of Agnes and the mountain men. Lost travelers were welcomed and provided food and warmth, and sisters were encouraged to accompany novices on tasks that required courage and endurance. Agnes participated actively, teaching young sisters not only the practical skills of survival and care but also the intangible lessons of dignity, empathy, and unwavering attention to fairness. The convent's leadership slowly acknowledged that their earlier judgment had been flawed, and while formal apologies were rare, small gestures signaled a shift toward inclusivity. Agnes learned that transformation was not immediate, but a gradual accumulation of conscious choices that redefined how the community perceived worth and virtue. Every act of fairness reinforced the lessons that had first been impressed upon her in the wilderness, under the silent witness of snow, trees, and the mountain men. One particularly harsh winter, when snow threatened to isolate the convent completely, Agnes was called upon to guide a group of sisters and villagers who had ventured too far for firewood. Drawing upon her experience and the lessons learned from Elias, she led them through drifts that swallowed paths, using markers left in previous years to navigate safely. The journey was grueling, demanding physical endurance and mental acuity, yet Agnes moved with composed determination, her voice steady as she directed the group. By the time they reached the safety of the convent, fatigue and relief mingled on everyone's faces, and Agnes realized that her previous struggles had prepared her to meet challenges no others could. In that moment, the whispers that had once plagued her seemed irrelevant, replaced by a respect that was quiet but solid, cemented in shared hardship and survival. Elias, watching from the ridges above, felt the familiar tug of satisfaction not from pride, but from recognition of shared resilience. Though he remained a solitary figure in the eyes of most villagers, his subtle influence on the convent's life was profound. Agnes often thought of him, not in longing, but in gratitude for the example of steadfastness and courage he represented. Their paths had crossed at a moment of peril, but the lessons endured far beyond that singular act. The mountain man's presence had been a catalyst, yet it was Agnes's own integrity, patience, and perseverance that transformed the convent. She understood that heroes sometimes appear in ordinary forms, and that salvation is not always dramatic, it is often a quiet insistence on truth, compassion, and action. Years passed, and the story of the nun and the mountain men became woven into local lore, told to novices and travelers alike as a parable of courage, fairness, and the consequences of judgment. Sisters spoke of Agnes not as an anomaly but as a standard of resilience, someone who had survived ostracism and reshaped her environment with quiet strength. Though she never sought recognition or accolades, the transformation she inspired was undeniable. Even those who had once doubted her learned to view difference as a facet of human dignity rather than a cause for suspicion. Agnes herself felt a deep sense of fulfillment, understanding that endurance paired with moral action could shift even entrenched social structures over time. The convent's gardens flourished under Agnes's care, becoming a symbol of nurture and perseverance. Each plant she tended reminded her of growth achieved through patience, care, and resilience. She often walked among the rows, reflecting on the lessons of winter storms and whispered judgments, realizing that adversity had honed her character in ways comfort never could. The youngest novices learned from her example, understanding that strength was not solely physical but moral, built upon consistent choices that favored fairness, empathy, and courage. Agnes's life became a living testament to the idea that change is possible when one refuses to accept unjust limitations. During harsh storms, villagers would sometimes hear the faint bell of the convent, signaling that Agnes was guiding travelers safely through treacherous paths. These journeys, though routine to her, were acts of quiet heroism, mirroring the unspoken bravery of Elias's interventions years before. When newcomers asked about the source of her knowledge and courage, Agnes would speak simply of lessons learned from hardship and the mountain, never attributing her success to any single individual. Yet the mountain man's influence was clear in every careful step, every strategic decision, and every instance of compassionate intervention. His legacy lived on through her actions, reinforcing the idea that courage and integrity could ripple outward, touching countless lives. Agnes's later years brought reflection and teaching as her primary responsibilities. She documented remedies, strategies for surviving harsh winters, and techniques for guiding travelers safely, compiling them into practical manuals for the convent. These writings, though devoid of personal glorification, became invaluable resources for generations to come. Through her words, the lessons learned from ostracism, endurance, and the mountain man's intervention were codified into practices that ensured the convent could operate with fairness and compassion, even in the face of future adversity. The enduring impact of her life demonstrated that one person's quiet resolve could reshape the culture of an entire community. The villagers, over time, began to view Agnes and the convent differently. Stories of judgment and isolation were gradually replaced with tales of courage, resilience, and community support. Agnes's name became associated not with her body, as it once had been, but with her unwavering dedication to fairness and care. When she walked through the village, children would follow, listening intently as she shared lessons about kindness, patience, and endurance. The transformation was subtle but profound. The fear and suspicion that had once governed interactions had been replaced by respect and admiration, grounded not in sensationalism, but in the observable consistency of Agnes's actions. Even after Elias stopped appearing, the mountain continued to serve as a silent teacher. Agnes would often stand at the edge of the convent's property, looking toward the ridges where he had guided her, reflecting on the unspoken lessons of courage, patience, and vigilance. Though the years had changed both of them, the memory of his intervention remained a touchstone, a reminder that integrity and bravery could manifest in unexpected forms. In every act of guidance, care, and quiet confrontation of injustice, Agnes honored the mountain man's unthinkable act, demonstrating that the true power of courage lies not in spectacle, but in steadfast, compassionate action. Nun ostracized story, mountain man rescues nun, inspirational religious story, faith and compassion narrative, convent life drama, winter survival story, body shaming redemption, true courage tale, inspirational mountain story, nun discrimination story, rural faith drama, unthinkable act kindness, Christian inspirational fiction, overcoming judgment story, mountain rescue faith, resilience and dignity, silent strength story, spiritual transformation tale, isolation and compassion, moral redemption story, inspirational short novel, faith-tested story, kindness changes lives, mountainman legend, convent redemption arc, human dignity narrative, inspirational drama fiction, faith versus prejudice, courage against injustice, redemption through action, perseverance against adversity, spiritual endurance narrative, compassion in isolation. The convent, once a place of whispered judgment, gradually became a haven of resilience under Agnes's quiet guidance. Every corner bore witness to her transformation, from a figure ostracized for her shape to a central presence whose strength reshaped the social fabric of the sisters' community. Tasks that were once dreaded, like tending the infirmary or collecting firewood, were now opportunities for shared learning and mutual respect. Agnes moved among the sisters with a calm authority that neither demanded deference nor provoked envy. Her patience had become a model for the younger novices, teaching them that true sanctity was measured not in appearances or perfection, but in steadfastness, courage, and a willingness to care for others, even when ignored or maligned. The habits that had once highlighted her differences now symbolized her commitment, the fabric draping her not with shame but with purpose, and she understood fully that the validation she sought had always existed within the integrity of her own actions. Elias continued to dwell in the mountains, yet the invisible threads connecting him to Agnes strengthened over time. Occasionally, he would descend with news of storms, changes in the wild, or simple provisions, moving without ceremony, leaving as quietly as he arrived. Agnes took these moments to internalize lessons of humility, resilience, and practical wisdom, understanding that heroism often manifested in the unremarkable. Their interactions required no speeches, the mountain man's guidance was encoded in deeds, and the echo of his presence shaped Agnes's leadership within the convent. Agnes's influence reached its fullest expression as she embraced teaching and mentorship within the convent, shaping the next generation of sisters in ways both practical and moral. Each day she walked among the novices, guiding them in prayer, chores, and survival skills, emphasizing that virtue and endurance were inseparable. She spoke of resilience not as abstract virtue, but as an embodied practice, the patient tending of gardens, the careful nursing of the sick, and the unwavering commitment to fairness in all interactions. Agnes encouraged the novices to face challenges with calm determination, to carry themselves with dignity regardless of judgment, and to recognize that true worth came from consistent acts of courage and compassion rather than outward approval. Over time, her lessons became embedded in the convent's culture, influencing decisions, rituals, and the ways sisters supported one another, creating an enduring legacy of moral and practical strength. The story of Agnes and the mountain men remained alive, circulating quietly among villagers, travelers, and novices alike. Though never exaggerated, it became a touchstone for discussions of justice, empathy, and courage. People recalled how Elias had risked ridicule to defend truth, how Agnes had faced ostracism with endurance, and how their combined acts of steadfastness transformed a community. The narrative reinforced the notion that heroism often appeared in unassuming forms, and that moral action could reverberate through time, altering attitudes and behaviors far beyond the original event. Villagers began to view the convent not as a site of judgment, but as a place of guidance, wisdom, and protection, a testament to the enduring impact of courage and integrity in the lives of ordinary people. Through harsh winters and isolated seasons, Agnes continued to lead rescue missions and care for travelers, employing strategies she had refined from her experience with Elias. She navigated treacherous snowdrifts, icy slopes, and dense forests with confidence and precision, ensuring the safety of those who might otherwise have succumbed to exposure. Her calm demeanor and strategic thinking became legendary among the villagers, who learned that the combination of moral courage and practical skill could save lives. Agnes's quiet competence not only earned respect but also gradually reshaped the local understanding of leadership. Authority was most effective when paired with humility, empathy, and action rooted in ethical principles. As Agnes aged, she reflected on the journey from ostracism to influence, recognizing that each challenge she had faced contributed to her strength and wisdom. She understood that the initial judgment she endured had served, in its own painful way, as preparation for the leadership and mentorship she now embodied. Her experience with isolation, prejudice, and the unspoken cruelty of her peers had forged in her a deep capacity for empathy, a steadfast commitment to justice, and an unwavering sense of duty. In these reflections, she found not bitterness, but gratitude, for the trials that shaped her, for the mountain men who intervened when it mattered most, and for the opportunity to transform both herself and the community she served. The convent's culture continued to evolve, integrating Agnes's teachings and the practical wisdom she had acquired over decades. Novices were trained in both spiritual discipline and practical survival, learning to navigate both moral and physical landscapes with confidence. Agnes emphasized the importance of observing and understanding the needs of others, recognizing that service required both insight and action. Her insistence on fairness, compassion, and resilience reshaped the convent's operations, ensuring that care and justice guided decisions at every level. Sisters began to support one another more openly, fostering a culture of collaboration, empathy, and shared responsibility, reflecting the lessons Agnes had internalized from her experiences of marginalization and rescue. Even in the quiet moments of reflection, Agnes often thought of Elias, standing silently on the ridges, observing without interference yet guiding through action. His presence had been a catalyst, demonstrating that intervention, even when unannounced or uncelebrated, could alter the trajectory of a life and a community. She realized that courage and integrity need not seek recognition. Their power lay in consistent, deliberate acts that challenged injustice and nurtured the vulnerable. This understanding shaped every decision she made within the convent and influenced the moral framework she imparted to those under her guidance, ensuring that his unthinkable act resonated far beyond its initial occurrence. The gardens, now flourishing, became a metaphor for Agnes's life and work, cultivated with patience, nurtured through careful attention, and resilient in the face of storms. Each plant represented the growth she had fostered in others, and the lessons she had imparted took root quietly but firmly in the community. The novices learned to care not only for the gardens, but for one another, embodying the principles of resilience, compassion, and moral integrity that Agnes had demonstrated through her life. Through this embodiment, Agnes taught that enduring impact was achieved not through grand gestures alone, but through consistent, thoughtful action that combined ethics with practice. The convent increasingly became a center of learning for both spiritual and practical skills, attracting attention from neighboring villages and clergy who sought guidance in fostering compassion and fairness within their own communities. Agnes's influence extended far beyond her immediate environment, her teachings spreading through mentorship, demonstration, and example. People recognized that her strength derived not from authority or status, but from lived experience, moral clarity, and the courage to act justly in the face of adversity. The convent's evolution became a living testament to the power of integrating ethical principles with practical wisdom, showing that institutions could change when guided by leaders grounded in both compassion and experience. In her later years, Agnes focused on documenting her knowledge and experiences, creating detailed manuals on survival, care for the sick, and the cultivation of moral resilience. These writings, practical yet infused with ethical insight, became invaluable resources for generations to come, ensuring that the lessons learned through hardship, ostracism, and courage would continue to guide future sisters. Through her documentation, she demonstrated that wisdom was not only inherited through direct experience, but could be shared and preserved, extending the reach of moral influence beyond personal presence. Her work solidified the enduring legacy of courage, compassion, and principled action. Even after she could no longer navigate the outer paths herself, Agnes remained a central figure of guidance and inspiration. The novices continued her practices, leading rescue missions, tending the gardens, and caring for the sick, all while upholding the moral and practical standards she had established. The convent had become a place where difference was respected, courage celebrated, and moral integrity valued above appearance. Agnes understood that the work she had begun would continue through the actions of others, ensuring that the unthinkable act of a mountain man long ago remained alive in principle, shaping lives and communities for generations. Nun ostracized story, mountain man rescues nun, inspirational religious story, faith and compassion narrative, convent life drama, winter survival story, body shaming redemption, true courage tale, inspirational mountain story, non-discrimination story, rural faith drama, unthinkable act kindness, Christian inspirational fiction, overcoming judgment story, mountain rescue faith, resilience and dignity, silent strength story, spiritual transformation tale, isolation and compassion, moral redemption story, inspirational short novel, faith-tested story, kindness changes lives, mountain man legend, convent redemption arc, human dignity narrative, inspirational drama fiction, faith versus prejudice, courage against injustice, redemption through action, perseverance against adversity, spiritual endurance narrative, compassion in isolation. Agnes's later years were marked by reflection, quiet satisfaction, and a deep understanding of the interplay between human frailty and moral courage. She would often sit by the convent's outer wall, looking toward the ridges where Elias had guided her so many years before, and she understood that his unthinkable act had been more than a rescue, it had been a lesson in integrity, compassion, and the power of action over words. The memory of that storm, the snow swallowing the paths, and the warmth of the fire in his cabin had become a touchstone in her life, reminding her that moral courage often arrived in unexpected forms. Though Elias himself was seldom seen, his presence lingered in the ethics she imparted, the confidence she instilled in novices, and the culture of the convent that now valued character over appearance. In every rescued traveler, every healed patient, and every young sister nurtured under her guidance, the legacy of his intervention lived on. The novices who grew up under Agnes's mentorship internalized lessons that were both practical and profound. They learned to navigate treacherous paths during harsh winters, to provide care without judgment, and to stand firm in the face of unfair treatment. They observed her moving through the halls with calm authority, her actions demonstrating that resilience was cultivated through consistent ethical practice rather than external validation. These girls, who might have once been intimidated or discouraged by the strictures of convent life, were inspired to embrace their own strengths and imperfections. They came to understand that difference was not a deficit but an opportunity for learning and growth. Through this influence, Agnes ensured that the moral and practical wisdom she had gained would propagate, shaping the convent and the surrounding communities for generations. The convent gardens flourished as a tangible reflection of the principles Agnes had instilled. Each plant and carefully tended plot symbolized patience, resilience, and the nurturing of potential. Novices learned to care for both the earth and each other, observing that attention, empathy, and consistent effort yielded profound results over time. Agnes often used these gardens as a metaphor, teaching that moral and spiritual growth, like cultivation of plants, required diligence, patience, and the courage to face challenges without yielding to fear or judgment. Through these lessons, the convent became not only a place of spiritual learning, but also a living example of how ethical and practical guidance could coexist, producing resilience in both character and community. Even as Elias aged and eventually disappeared from sight, the lessons he imparted endured through Agnes's actions. The mountain men had demonstrated that courage and integrity need not seek recognition, and Agnes internalized that ethic completely. She continued to navigate the outer paths, guide travelers, and confront challenges with calm decisiveness. Agnes's final years were a blend of reflection, mentorship, and continued service, her days marked by quiet purpose rather than spectacle. She moved slowly through the convent, yet every gesture carried authority grounded in decades of experience and moral clarity. Novices sought her counsel on matters both practical and ethical, and she guided them with patience, reinforcing the principles of resilience, compassion, and integrity. Even in frailty, her presence inspired confidence. She embodied the understanding that strength is measured not solely by physical capacity, but by the steadfastness of character and consistency of action. The convent had become a living testament to her life's work, a place where difference was respected, courage was nurtured, and moral education intertwined seamlessly with daily practice. Agnes often reflected on the journey that had brought her from ostracism to this position of quiet influence, acknowledging that every hardship she endured had refined her capacity to lead and guide with fairness. Though Elias had long retreated to the solitude of the mountains, his influence remained a persistent force in Agnes's philosophy and actions. She frequently recalled the night he had rescued her from the snow, the warmth of the fire, and the absence of judgment, understanding that his intervention had been a lesson in integrity as much as a rescue. His example reinforced the principle that courage and moral action need not seek recognition, their impact was measured in outcomes rather than applause. Agnes carried this understanding into every decision she made, every lesson she taught, and every challenge she faced within and beyond the convent walls. Through her actions, she ensured that the values he had demonstrated, steadfastness, compassion, and ethical clarity, would continue to shape the lives of those around her. The convent's operational culture flourished under Agnes's careful stewardship, blending spiritual devotion with practical resilience. Novices learned to navigate treacherous terrain, care for the sick, and act decisively in morally complex situations, embodying the lessons of endurance and ethical courage. Agnes emphasized that true leadership required attention to both principle and detail, teaching that moral clarity was expressed as much in careful action as in thoughtful reflection. Her guidance ensured that each sister understood her role not only as a spiritual devotee, but as an agent of practical compassion, capable of responding effectively to emergencies and injustices alike. Through this integration, the convent became a model of balance between faith, service, and moral integrity. The convent gardens, tended under Agnes's guidance, served as both practical sustenance and metaphorical instruction. She taught novices to observe growth, respond to signs of struggle, and nurture life with patience and consistency. Every plant symbolized resilience, every cultivated plot a lesson in the rewards of diligent care. These practices extended beyond horticulture into social and ethical lessons, tending to the vulnerable required attentiveness, compassion, and a long-term perspective, just as moral integrity demanded sustained effort over time. Through these daily acts, Agnes embedded a culture of resilience and ethical mindfulness within the convent, ensuring that the values learned through her life and Elias's intervention would be preserved in action as well as in principle. Even as her physical strength waned, Agnes continued to lead by example, demonstrating that moral courage was not diminished by age or limitation. She supervised rescue operations, cared for travelers and villagers, and provided guidance in times of crisis, always prioritizing the well-being of others over personal comfort. Her presence reinforced the understanding that enduring impact is achieved not through momentary heroism, but through sustained ethical action. Novices and villagers alike internalized these lessons, recognizing that integrity and compassion required ongoing commitment, and that the influence of one principled individual could ripple across communities, shaping behavior, decisions, and attitudes for generations. Agnes's mentorship emphasized the cultivation of moral discernment alongside practical skill. She instructed novices to assess situations carefully, weigh consequences thoughtfully, and act decisively when ethical imperatives demanded intervention. These lessons were reinforced through hands-on practice, observation of her own conduct, and reflection on the consequences of past decisions. She emphasized that courage was inseparable from responsibility, and that the defense of human dignity required both awareness and action. In doing so, Agnes ensured that the convent would continue to produce sisters capable of navigating both the spiritual and practical challenges of their environment with wisdom and integrity. Through decades of service, Agnes observed the gradual transformation of community attitudes. Villagers who had once questioned her abilities now sought her guidance, respecting the combination of skill, moral clarity, and calm decisiveness she embodied. Sisters who had once whispered judgment now approached her for advice and support, recognizing that resilience, compassion, and ethical consistency were far more valuable than conformity or superficial approval. Agnes's life became a template for enduring influence, demonstrating that personal integrity, when practiced consistently and applied to service, could reshape the culture of entire communities. The convent's reputation evolved accordingly, becoming a sanctuary of moral and practical instruction. Her written manuals and records further ensured that her influence would extend beyond her lifetime. These works, carefully detailed and imbued with ethical insight, documented strategies for survival, care, and moral leadership. Agnes viewed these writings not as personal legacy, but as practical tools to guide future generations in navigating adversity with integrity and compassion. The manuals provided novices with a blueprint for integrating resilience, practical wisdom, and ethical courage, ensuring that the lessons derived from ostracism, perseverance, and the mountain man's intervention could continue to guide others effectively. In this way, Agnes ensured that the principles of courage, fairness, and compassion would remain actionable and enduring. Even in solitude or quiet reflection, Agnes's thoughts often returned to the mountain man whose intervention had changed the course of her life. Though he was rarely seen, the lessons of his actions, the unselfish courage, the moral clarity, and the commitment to act without expectation of recognition, continued to guide her every decision. She recognized that his influence had provided her with both a model and a catalyst, allowing her to transform personal hardship into communal benefit. The enduring resonance of his act, paired with her own steady application of moral and practical wisdom, ensured that the convent, its novices, and the broader community were forever shaped by the convergence of courage, integrity, and compassion. Agnes's life concluded not with fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction. She had transformed ostracism into influence, prejudice into respect, and marginalization into moral and practical authority. Her teachings, practices, and mentorship continued to shape the convent, guiding new generations to integrate ethical courage with practical skill. The legacy of her life, rooted in the unthinkable act of a mountain man and nurtured through decades of steadfast service, served as a testament to the enduring power of integrity, compassion, and resilience. Through her, the lessons of courage, fairness, and moral action continued to ripple outward, shaping the hearts and lives of countless individuals beyond her immediate sphere. Nun Ostracized story, Mountain Men rescues nun, inspirational religious story, faith and compassion narrative, convent life drama, winter survival story, body shaming redemption, true courage tale, inspirational mountain story, nun discrimination story, rural faith drama, unthinkable act kindness, Christian inspirational fiction, overcoming judgment story, mountain rescue faith, resilience and dignity, silent strength story, spiritual transformation tale, isolation and compassion, moral redemption story, inspirational short novel, faith-tested story, kindness changes lives, mountain man legend, convent redemption arc, human dignity narrative, inspirational drama fiction, faith versus prejudice, courage against injustice, redemption through action, perseverance against adversity, spiritual endurance narrative, compassion in isolation. After Agnes passed into old age, her presence continued to shape the convent in subtle yet profound ways. Novices and older sisters alike carried forward her lessons, not as formal doctrine, but as lived example. Every action within the convent, from tending the sick to managing the gardens, from guiding travelers through storms to mediating conflicts among sisters, bore the imprint of her philosophy, that integrity, compassion, and courage were inseparable, and that moral authority arose from consistent, thoughtful action rather than rank or appearance. Agnes had transformed the convent's culture from one of judgment and exclusion into a community rooted in respect and resilience. Even the youngest novices, who had never witnessed her struggles firsthand, understood through practice and observation that strength and virtue were cultivated, not inherited, and that moral courage often required standing firm against both circumstance and prejudice. The legacy of Elias, the mountain man whose unthinkable act had begun this transformation, remained woven into the convent's ethos. Though few had ever met him, his intervention became a symbol of principled courage and practical wisdom, teaching that true heroism often manifests quietly and without expectation of recognition. Stories of his rescue circulated among villagers and travelers, always told alongside lessons in integrity and perseverance. The convent honored this legacy in its daily routines and teachings, ensuring that the principles he embodied, care for the vulnerable, readiness to act, and moral clarity, were instilled alongside spiritual discipline. Agnes had internalized these lessons and extended them outward, demonstrating that the ripple effect of a single act of courage could endure across generations. As decades passed, the convent flourished not only as a spiritual center but also as a hub of practical knowledge and ethical mentorship. Novices trained in survival skills, moral discernment, and leadership, preparing them to navigate both physical and social challenges. Agnes's influence was evident in every ritual, every act of service, and every decision made within the convent walls. Her life illustrated that enduring impact required consistency, patience, and courage in the face of adversity. The culture she fostered rejected superficial judgment, valuing action, character, and empathy above appearance or conformity. Sisters who had initially participated. Over the years, Agnes's story became more than just a tale of survival or rescue. It evolved into a symbol of hope and moral guidance for the surrounding villages. Travelers who once whispered of the ostracized nun now spoke of her courage, her integrity, and the unyielding consistency with which she guided the convent and the community. Parents would bring children to the convent to witness the practical lessons she imparted: navigation through harsh winters, tending to the sick, and resolving conflicts with fairness. The narrative of judgment turned into a lesson of resilience and moral clarity, demonstrating that the measure of a person's character transcends appearance, and that true courage often requires steadfast adherence to principles in the face of adversity. Agnes, once marginalized, had become the moral and practical heart of the community, a living example of how integrity can shape entire social ecosystems. The convent itself became a living laboratory of ethics and practical wisdom, reflecting the lessons Agnes had learned from her own experiences and from Elias. Novices were trained to act decisively and compassionately, understanding that moral courage required a balance between awareness, empathy, and action. Agnes encouraged observation of the natural world as a teacher of resilience and foresight, drawing parallels between tending gardens, navigating treacherous paths, and nurturing relationships. These lessons were embedded into the daily routines of the convent, reinforcing the idea that ethical action is inseparable from practical wisdom, and that moral leadership arises from consistent, thoughtful engagement with both people and circumstance. Despite the passing decades, the memory of Elias remained a guiding force. The mountain man's unthinkable act of courage had set in motion a series of transformations that extended far beyond the initial rescue. Agnes often reflected on the significance of intervention, understanding that even a single moment of selfless action can ripple outward, influencing countless lives. She taught the novices that heroism is not measured by recognition or reward, but by the tangible impact of principled deeds. Through this lens, every act of guidance, care, and moral discernment within the convent became a continuation of that initial, extraordinary intervention, reinforcing the enduring connection between courage, integrity, and community transformation. As Agnes aged, she began focusing more on legacy and sustainability, ensuring that her teachings would endure beyond her own lifetime. She formalized training in survival, ethical decision-making, and compassionate leadership, creating a curriculum that integrated practical skills with moral instruction. Novices learned not only how to navigate storms or tend to the sick, but also how to exercise judgment, act with empathy, and maintain courage under social or institutional pressure. Agnes's emphasis on intentionality and consistency ensured that future generations of sisters would embody the values she had cultivated, continuing to promote fairness, resilience, and moral clarity throughout the convent and the broader community. The convent gardens, now lush and orderly, symbolized the fruition of decades of patience, guidance, and care. Each plant represented growth achieved through consistent attention and ethical cultivation, mirroring the moral development of the novices. Agnes used the gardens to teach the importance of observation, patience, and responsiveness, showing that true growth, whether in nature or character, requires ongoing effort, attentiveness, and commitment. The novices internalized these lessons, understanding that nurturing life and virtue is a deliberate, sustained practice, and that small, consistent acts of care can have profound and lasting effects on a community. Even in her final years, Agnes maintained active involvement in the convent's operations, supervising rescues, guiding novices, and mediating conflicts with calm authority. Her presence reinforced the principle that ethical courage is expressed through action, not words alone, and that sustained integrity shapes not only individuals, but entire communities. Villagers continued to rely on her guidance during emergencies, respecting her judgment and learning from her decisiveness. Through these ongoing contributions, Agnes ensured that the values of compassion, resilience, and moral fortitude remained embedded in both convent and community, preserving the transformative legacy initiated by her own endurance and Elias's intervention. Agnes's writings and records became foundational texts, blending practical guidance with moral reflection. They detailed strategies for survival, ethical decision-making, and the cultivation of resilience, providing future novices with a blueprint for navigating both physical and social challenges. Her emphasis on clarity, consistency, and ethical reasoning ensured that the lessons derived from ostracism, endurance, and intervention would remain actionable and impactful. These texts, while devoid of personal glorification, became invaluable resources for shaping future leaders, demonstrating that the combination of courage, compassion, and integrity could guide decision-making long after her lifetime. The community around the convent gradually shifted its perception of Agnes and the institution itself. Where suspicion and judgment had once prevailed, respect and admiration now took root. Villagers sought guidance, assistance, and moral counsel, acknowledging the convent as a center of practical and ethical learning. Agnes's influence extended beyond spiritual instruction, reshaping attitudes toward fairness, service, and human dignity. Her consistent example underscored the principle that personal integrity and moral courage could transform not only individual lives, but also social norms, creating a ripple effect of ethical practice throughout the wider community. In quiet moments of reflection, Agnes often considered the broader implications of her life's work. She recognized that ostracism, suffering, and challenge had prepared her to enact meaningful change, and that Elias's unthinkable act had provided the critical impetus for her transformation. By integrating these experiences into her daily practice, mentorship, and written guidance, Agnes ensured that her life would continue to serve as a model of courage, resilience, and ethical leadership. The convent became a place where moral and practical instruction were inseparable, a testament to the enduring power of principled action. Agnes's final days were marked not by ceremony, but by the fulfillment of a life spent in service, reflection, and mentorship. She had transformed the narrative of ostracism into one of influence, courage, and moral clarity, leaving behind a community defined by resilience, empathy, and ethical fortitude. Her teachings, writings, and example ensured that the legacy of the mountain man's unthinkable act continued to resonate, inspiring generations to come. In every rescued traveler, nurtured novice, and flourishing garden, the principles of integrity, compassion, and perseverance lived on, cementing Agnes's life as a testament to the transformative power of moral courage. Nun ostracized story, mountain man rescues nun, inspirational religious story, faith and compassion narrative, convent life drama, winter survival story, body shaming redemption, true courage tale, inspirational mountain story, nun discrimination story, rural faith drama, unthinkable act kindness, Christian inspirational fiction, overcoming judgment story, mountain rescue faith, resilience and dignity, silent strength story, spiritual transformation tale, isolation and compassion, moral redemption story, inspirational short novel, faith-tested story, kindness changes lives, mountain man legend, convent redemption arc, human dignity narrative, inspirational drama fiction, faith versus prejudice, courage against injustice, redemption through action, perseverance against adversity, spiritual endurance narrative, compassion in isolation. Generations after Agnes's time, the convent continued to flourish as a center of moral and practical guidance. Novices, inspired by her life and the legacy of Elias's unthinkable act, carried forward the principles of resilience, compassion, and ethical courage. The lessons she had instilled, tending to the vulnerable, acting decisively in the face of danger, and maintaining integrity under scrutiny, were now deeply embedded in the convent's culture. Travelers and villagers alike sought the convent not merely for spiritual guidance, but for practical wisdom and moral counsel, recognizing that the principles Agnes had embodied were as essential to survival and community cohesion as faith itself. Stories of her courage and leadership were shared across villages, illustrating that personal endurance and principled action could reshape social perceptions and create lasting positive change. The convent gardens, once a symbol of Agnes's patient guidance, now served as a living classroom for generations of sisters. Each plant reflected the virtues of care, attention, and resilience that she had emphasized, and novices learned to translate these lessons into interpersonal relationships and community leadership. By observing the steady growth of the gardens, sisters internalized the importance of consistent, ethical action, that nurturing life, fostering fairness, and responding thoughtfully to challenges were ongoing practices, not one-time efforts. The cultivation of the gardens mirrored the cultivation of moral and spiritual character, creating a holistic framework for teaching resilience, empathy, and responsible leadership. Elias's influence, though physical presence had long faded, persisted as a philosophical and ethical touchstone within the convent. His initial intervention, seemingly singular and isolated, became an enduring example of moral courage in action. Agnes had internalized this lesson and amplified it through decades of mentorship and leadership, demonstrating that the ripples of a single unselfish act could resonate far beyond its immediate context. Novices were taught to recognize opportunities for similar interventions in their own lives, understanding that true courage often manifested in subtle, unrecognized acts that nevertheless had profound consequences. Through this lens, the convent became a living repository of moral wisdom, shaped by experience, reflection, and consistent ethical action. Over time, Agnes's writings gained recognition as foundational texts for training novices in practical skills, moral reasoning, and ethical leadership. These manuals blended guidance on survival, care, and decision-making with reflections on integrity and compassion, ensuring that future generations would have access to both practical tools and ethical frameworks. The combination of instruction and moral philosophy reinforced the principle that leadership required both competence and conscience, and that ethical courage could be cultivated deliberately through education, reflection, and consistent practice. The convent, guided by these texts, became a